Do you hear that? John Peterson lowered his binoculars and squinted at the horizon. The early evening sun threw long shadows over the gently rolling plains. Beside him, his younger brother Mark tilted his head, listening intently. A low, rhythmic hum began to build in the distance, almost like a steady drumbeat beneath the breeze. It wasn't the sound of the windmills or any of the farm equipment John knew so well. Could be a storm, Mark said, glancing at the sky. Or maybe another drone test from the airbase? I don't think so, John replied, his tone skeptical. They usually give us a heads up if they're flying low near the farm. The hum grew louder. Both men stepped off the porch of the farmhouse and walked toward the edge of their field where the wheat swayed under the golden light. John's hand instinctively went to the multi-tool at his belt, more habit than a practical response to what might be coming. Then they saw it. A silver shape broke over the crest of the hill, hovering low and smooth above the ground. It was no drone and definitely not any kind of plane. The craft glimmered like liquid metal, sleek and elongated, with no visible wings or propellers. It moved with an eerie grace as if the laws of gravity didn't apply. What the hell? Mark whispered, stepping closer. John grabbed his arm. Hold on. We don't know what that thing is. Mark pulled free. We can't just stand here. What if it's, I don't know, some government tech or something? Yeah, and what if it's not? John shot back. I've been around long enough to know when to keep my distance. The craft suddenly stopped about 50 yards from them, hovering silently. A faint, greenish-blue light began to pulse along its hull. Both brothers stared, frozen in place, as a section of the craft's surface rippled and slid open like liquid glass. From the opening emerged a figure that looked humanoid, but only just. She was tall, with skin so pale it appeared luminous. Her long, flowing hair shifted between dark blue and black like it was reflecting the sky above. Her movements were fluid yet deliberate, as if she were unaccustomed to walking on solid ground. Stay back, John said under his breath, stepping protectively in front of Mark. I mean no harm, the alien said. Her voice was smooth, almost musical, but tinged with an accent they couldn't place. She raised both hands in a gesture of peace. I come seeking assistance. Assistance? Mark repeated, his voice cracking slightly. What kind of assistance? My craft is damaged, she explained. I cannot leave this planet without repairs. Yeah, I'm sure that's all you're here for, John muttered. No offense, but why should we trust you? The alien tilted her head as if considering the question. If I intended harm, I would not have revealed myself. I am here alone. My people do not even know I have landed. Mark glanced at John. I mean, she's got a point. John sighed heavily. Okay, but don't think I'm going to let my guard down. He gestured toward the barn. We've got a workshop in there. Maybe you can explain exactly what kind of repairs you need. The alien inclined her head. That would be acceptable. The brothers led her back toward the farmhouse, keeping a wary eye on her the entire time. She walked with an unusual grace, her violet eyes scanning everything with keen interest. When they entered the barn, the alien's gaze lingered on the tools hanging neatly along the walls, the half-finished equipment John had been tinkering with, and the old tractor parked in the corner. I must repair the energy core, she said, pointing to a device she had retrieved from her ship. It was a compact, cylindrical object, glowing faintly in a deep shade of blue. The containment field is destabilized. John rubbed the back of his neck. Containment field, huh? That's a bit above my pay grade. Mark, always the more adventurous of the two, stepped closer. Let's take a look. I mean, it's not like we don't have the tools. What's the worst that could happen? Explosive decompression, the alien said matter-of-factly. Mark froze, then turned to John. What do you think? John sighed again. I think you're going to get us killed one day. Fine. Show me what we're working with. Over the next several hours, the three of them worked side by side, the alien carefully instructing them on how to handle the strange materials and energy cells she had brought. While Mark asked an endless stream of questions, what's your name, by the way? What's your planet like? How do you even know our language? John focused on the task at hand, making precise adjustments and connecting components as she directed. My name is Nissa, she eventually said in response to one of Mark's questions. My home is very different from yours. I studied your languages before I arrived. It was necessary. Necessary for what? John asked, finally looking up from the circuitry he was soldering. Nissa hesitated, her expression unreadable. To ensure I could communicate. That is all. John exchanged a glance with Mark, but neither pressed further. Whatever her reasons, she wasn't ready to share them. As the night wore on, a strange camaraderie began to form. Nissa was patient, explaining concepts that went far beyond anything John or Mark had ever dealt with. Mark cracked jokes to lighten the mood, and even John found himself impressed by Nissa's steady composure and expertise. By the time they finished stabilizing the core, the tension in the room had eased considerably. It should hold, Nissa said, inspecting their work. You have my gratitude. John shrugged. It's not like we had much of a choice. Mark grinned. You're welcome. And hey, if you need more help, you know where to find us. Nissa gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. You are different from what I expected. What did you expect? Mark asked, leaning against the workbench. Hostility. Fear. Perhaps violence, she admitted. John folded his arms. Yeah, well, don't think we're all sunshine and rainbows. But we can be decent if you give us a chance. Nissa inclined her head again, this time more deeply. You have given me more than a chance. For that I am grateful. It wasn't much, but it was the start of something. As the first rays of dawn crept through the barn's windows, the three of them stood together, their unlikely partnership sealed by shared effort and a cautious, tentative trust. You've got to be kidding me. Mark crossed his arms, leaning against the tractor. How many times do you need us to flip this thing around? Nissa didn't glance up from the holographic display that floated above her palm. 3 more adjustments. The device must be precisely aligned to absorb the energy in this environment. John knelt beside the cylindrical core they'd worked on the night before, wiping his hands on a rag. Mark, just do it. It's not like we've got anything better to do. Mark sighed heavily but complied, helping John lift the device onto its side. As they worked, Nissa adjusted a control panel that hovered in midair. She moved her fingers with the precision of a seasoned technician, her violet eyes flicking over readouts too complex for the brothers to follow. What exactly is this thing supposed to do? John asked after a moment. Nissa paused and looked at him. It stabilizes the core's output, allowing it to draw energy from the ambient electromagnetic fields. Without it, my ship remains inoperative. And how long will that take? Mark asked. Not long, she said. Once calibrated, it will begin to recharge immediately. John stood and dusted off his hands. Great. So, what happens after that? You just fly off and we never hear from you again. Nissa didn't answer immediately. Her gaze lingered on the device, her expression distant. Perhaps, she said finally. It depends on what I learn while I'm here. Mark raised an eyebrow. What you learn? What's left to learn? You landed, you fixed your ship, and now you're out of here. Nissa turned to face him. I did not come here simply to repair my ship. I came to observe. John frowned. Observe what? Nissa hesitated, her gaze shifting between the two brothers. Your world. Your people. I was sent to determine if humanity was worth engaging. Engaging in what? Mark asked, leaning forward. Collaboration. Coexistence, Nissa said, though her tone made it clear she was choosing her words carefully. We have remained separate from you for many years. There are those among my people who believe it should stay that way. And you? John pressed. I am undecided, Nissa admitted. Your species is unexpected. Unexpected how? Mark prodded. Nissa glanced at him. You're more curious than I anticipated. Curious is one way to put it, John said, smirking. Stubborn is another. But why all the secrecy? Why not just tell us you were here to see if we're worth talking to? Nissa straightened, her expression neutral. Because not all of my people share my curiosity. Some would see this as a mistake. John crossed his arms. So you're here behind their backs? I am here, Nissa said, to make my own judgment. Mark laughed. Man, your people must be a real blast to hang out with. Nissa tilted her head. I fail to see the humor. Never mind, Mark said, grinning. But seriously, how do we measure up so far? She hesitated again. You are resourceful. And you work together well. That is unexpected. Unexpected seems to be your favorite word, John said. Nissa's lips twitched just slightly. Perhaps. They worked in relative silence after that, adjusting the device until Nissa declared it aligned. She tapped a few commands on the holographic panel and the core began to hum softly, its blue glow growing brighter. It is ready, she said. The recharging process has begun. Does that mean you're leaving soon? John asked. Nissa looked at him. Not yet. The process will take time. Mark nudged John with his elbow. Guess she's not rid of us yet. I don't mind, Nissa said, surprising them both. I find your presence helpful. Mark grinned. Don't get too comfortable. We're not exactly a bed and breakfast. I'm aware, Nissa said. Though your hospitality has been generous. Well, you caught us on a good day, John said. So what now? Nissa turned back to the device, her expression thoughtful. Now, I observe. Observe what, exactly? Mark asked. Everything, Nissa said. How you live, how you work, how you interact with each other. It is all relevant. John raised an eyebrow. You've got a lot of learning ahead of you then. I welcome it, Nissa said simply. Over the next several days, Nissa shadowed the brothers as they went about their daily routine. She helped Mark repair a broken fence and joined John in the workshop where he was refurbishing an old generator. Her presence was quiet but not intrusive, and she showed a surprising aptitude for understanding their tools and techniques. "You learn fast," John remarked one afternoon as they worked on the generator. "Quicker than some of the guys I used to serve with." "I have been trained to adapt," Nissa said, tightening a bolt with practiced ease. "Trained how?" Mark asked, leaning against the workbench. "You some kind of space engineer?" Nissa's gaze flicked to him. "Something like that." "Not much for specifics, are you?" Mark teased. "I prefer to observe and analyze," Nissa replied. "But if you must know, I was trained in multiple disciplines, including engineering, science, and diplomacy." Mark whistled. "Diplomacy? So you're like a space ambassador?" "Not exactly," Nissa said. "I am a scout. I gather information. My role is to understand and report back." "To the people who don't even know you're here?" John asked. Nissa hesitated. "My actions are not sanctioned. I chose this mission on my own." Mark raised an eyebrow. "That's gutsy. What happens if they find out?" Nissa's expression hardened slightly. "That is my concern, not yours." John studied her for a moment. "Why take that risk?" "Because I believe it is necessary," she said simply. The brothers exchanged a glance, then returned to their work. Over time, Nissa began to ask more questions about human history, their technology, their culture. John found himself explaining things he'd never thought twice about, while Mark took every opportunity to crack jokes and offer exaggerated tales of human exploits. "Is he always like this?" Nissa asked John one evening as Mark regaled her with a wildly embellished story about a bear he'd supposedly wrestled in Alaska. "Pretty much," John said, shaking his head. "But he means well." "I gathered as much," Nissa said, her lips quirking in a small smile. As they worked and talked, a tentative friendship began to form. Nissa's initial aloofness gave way to moments of genuine curiosity, and the brothers found themselves enjoying her company more than they expected. By the time the core was fully charged, the idea of her leaving felt oddly bittersweet. "What's next?" John asked one morning as they stood near the now fully functional device. "I must return to my ship," Nissa said. "And decide what to do from there." Mark nodded. "Well, you know where to find us if you need anything." Nissa inclined her head. "Your assistance has been valuable. I will not forget it." "Don't be a stranger," Mark said with a grin. Nissa hesitated, then said, "I will consider it." As the day stretched on, the brothers watched her prepare to leave. They didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: they'd come a long way from that first wary meeting in the field. Whatever else might come, they had managed to bridge a gap neither of them had ever thought possible. It was late afternoon, and the summer heat was finally beginning to wane. The three of them were out near the barn, sorting through an old collection of parts John had stashed away years ago. Nissa stood off to the side, inspecting a rusted panel with the same intensity she'd shown when analyzing her energy core. Mark sat cross-legged on the ground, wiping down a set of gears. "You'd think she never saw a rusty old hunk of metal before," he said under his breath to John. John grinned. "Maybe they don't have rust in space." Nissa straightened, holding up the panel. "This material is fascinating. The degradation patterns suggest an oxidizing environment and high moisture content." "That's rust," Mark said with a smirk. "Good old-fashioned earth rust." Nissa turned the panel in her hands. "Doesn't it concern you that your structures are so vulnerable to it?" Mark shrugged. "Not much we can do about it. Things break, we fix them. That's life." John walked over, leaning against the barn wall. "You never did tell us much about where you come from. Is it all high-tech and shiny? No rust, no dirt, no mess." Nissa hesitated, setting the panel down carefully. "My home is different. Our infrastructure is designed to minimize waste and deterioration, but it is not without flaws." "So, no paradise, huh?" Mark said, tossing a cleaned gear into the pile. "Good to know we're not the only ones with problems." Nissa didn't respond immediately. Instead, she crouched next to the pile of parts, her hands tracing the contours of a gear. "Your world is more raw. It is not what I expected." "Expected how?" John asked, crossing his arms. Nissa looked up at him, her violet eyes sharp and thoughtful. "You adapt to challenges in ways that seem inefficient yet effective." "It's unusual." Mark chuckled. "She's trying to say we're a mess, but we make it work." "Perhaps," Nissa said, almost smiling. The banter carried them through the afternoon as they sorted and salvaged. Nissa asked more questions than usual about the purpose of each part, how it was made, why it had been kept even after it broke. John found himself explaining things he hadn't thought about in years, like the makeshift irrigation pump he'd cobbled together one dry summer, or the time Mark had tried to build a wind turbine out of bicycle parts. You actually thought that would work? Nissa asked, raising an elegant eyebrow at Mark. Hey, it worked for a whole week before it blew apart. Mark protested. Nissa's lips curved into what might have been a smile. I see. John leaned on the pile of parts, wiping sweat from his forehead. So, what's the plan once you get back to your ship? Nissa grew quiet, her gaze turning distant. I will need to review my findings and determine the next course of action. Mark stretched his legs out and leaned back on his elbows. Sounds like you don't have it all figured out yet. I do not, Nissa admitted. There are complications. Like what? John asked, watching her carefully. Nissa hesitated. My people may not approve of what I've learned here. They may see it as a disruption. Mark raised an eyebrow. Disruption? What, are we too messy for them? Nissa shook her head. Not messy. Different. Unpredictable. Unpredictable can be good, John said, his voice steady. Sometimes the unexpected is what pushes you forward. Nissa glanced at him, her expression unreadable. You believe unpredictability is an advantage? Depends on the situation, John replied. But yeah, it can be. Mark grinned. He just means we're awesome because we wing it. Nissa tilted her head as if weighing the idea. It is an interesting perspective. The conversation drifted as they worked. Nissa seemed less reserved, more willing to engage. Mark took every opportunity to crack a joke or tell a story while John focused on keeping the tasks moving. They worked in tandem like a team that had been together far longer than a few weeks. By the time they'd sorted the entire pile, the sun was dipping low, painting the sky in warm shades of orange and pink. They sat on the porch, sipping water and enjoying the brief moment of calm. Do you ever get sunsets like this where you're from? John asked, nodding toward the horizon. Nissa studied the sky. Not quite like this. The colors are more subdued. Less vivid. Well, you can't beat Earth's sunsets, Mark said, leaning back on the porch rail. They're one of the perks of being human. Nissa turned her gaze to him. You take pride in such small things? Damn right, Mark said with a grin. It's the little stuff that makes life worth it. Nissa looked at John as if seeking confirmation. He shrugged. He's got a point. The big things matter, sure, but it's the small moments that stick with you. Nissa seemed to consider this, her gaze lingering on the fading light. It is a strange way to think. But not a bad one, John said. No, Nissa admitted softly. Not a bad one. As the evening deepened, they sat in companionable silence. The boundary between them, once sharp and unyielding, felt more like a faint line now, one that neither side was eager to redraw. The next morning, Mark and John were tinkering with the old generator again, adjusting its new components after some trial runs the day before. Nissa stood nearby, observing silently, her arms crossed. It wasn't until John wiped his hands on a rag and stood back to assess their progress that she finally spoke. It's running more efficiently now, she said, inclining her head toward the humming generator. John nodded. Yeah, it's working better. Still not perfect, but good enough for now. Good enough, Nissa repeated as if testing the phrase. You often said, me spaceship core here. Just a rusty old generator. Nissa's lips pressed into a thin line. There is something to be said for your willingness to continue despite flaws. John straightened up and glanced at her. So what about you? Is your ship ready to go? Nissa hesitated. It is functional. The repairs are complete. But you're still here, Mark pointed out. What's the holdup? Nissa seemed to weigh her words carefully. I am considering my next steps. My mission was to observe, to determine if there is a place for collaboration. But now that I've seen what I needed to see, the decision is not so simple. Mark raised an eyebrow. You're having second thoughts? It is not second thoughts, Nissa said, her voice firmer now. It is uncertainty. My people expect me to return with a clear assessment, but what I have learned here defies simple conclusions. John leaned against the workbench. Let me guess. You don't think we're as bad as they made us out to be? Nissa's gaze flicked toward him, and for a moment, he thought she might deny it. Instead, she said quietly, No, you are not. Mark snorted. Well, thanks for the glowing review. Nissa almost smiled. You are complicated. That's humanity in a nutshell, John said. Messy, complicated, and unpredictable. But that's part of what makes us who we are. Nissa tilted her head. It is not what I was prepared to encounter. Yeah, well, welcome to Earth, Mark said, gesturing around them. We're full of surprises. For a moment, the three of them stood in comfortable silence, the hum of the generator the only sound. Then Nissa spoke again. I must decide what to report back to my people. If I tell them what I have seen, it may influence how they view your kind. It may lead to unexpected consequences. John frowned. What kind of consequences? Nissa hesitated. If I present humanity in a favorable light, it could open the door to dialogue, perhaps even collaboration. But not everyone would support that. There are those who would see it as a threat. Mark crossed his arms. A threat? To what? To our way of life, Nissa said simply. There are factions among my people who believe that maintaining distance is safer, that humanity's unpredictability is dangerous. John nodded slowly. But you don't agree. Nissa didn't respond immediately. When she finally spoke, her voice was softer. I see potential. I see possibilities that my people may not have considered. But my position is complicated. You're afraid they won't listen to you, John said, his tone steady. Yes, Nissa admitted. Mark clapped a hand on her shoulder. Look, if you're worried about convincing them, just tell them what you saw here. Tell them about the old generator, the broken tractor, and how we fixed them up. Tell them how we figure things out as we go. Nissa glanced at the hand on her shoulder, then back at Mark. And you think that will be enough? I think it's a start, Mark said. No one's perfect, Nissa. Not us, not you, not them. But that doesn't mean we can't work together. John nodded in agreement. He's right. Just be honest about what you found. If they can't handle it, that's on them. But at least you'll know you tried. Nissa considered this, her gaze flicking between the two brothers. Honesty is not always rewarded. No, it's not, John said. But it's better than lying. You came here for answers, right? If you found them, then it's your job to tell the truth. That's what leaders do. I am not a leader, Nissa said. Mark grinned. Maybe not officially, but you're acting like one. Nissa almost smiled. That is unexpected. Well, get used to it, Mark said. You've been around us long enough to know we don't do things by the book. Nissa's expression softened, and for the first time, John thought he saw a flicker of genuine warmth in her eyes. I will consider your advice. Thank you. Anytime, John said. And hey, if you need more help, you know where to find us. Nissa nodded. I will remember that. As the sun began to set, they sat on the porch again, this time not as strangers or cautious allies, but as something closer to friends. Nissa still had her decision to make, but at least now she wasn't facing it alone. Morning broke over the farm, the golden light spilling across the fields. John was already up, seated on the porch steps with a steaming mug of coffee in hand. Mark stepped out a moment later, yawning and stretching. You're up early, Mark muttered, joining John on the steps. Couldn't sleep, John replied, his gaze fixed on the distant hills. Too much on my mind. Yeah, I guess having an alien in the barn does that to a guy, Mark said with a grin. John smirked faintly but didn't respond. A quiet settled between them until Nissa emerged from the barn, her movements deliberate and calm as always. She carried the small cylindrical core in her hands, its faint blue glow pulsing steadily. Mark raised a hand in greeting. Morning, Nissa. Sleep well. She approached, stopping at the base of the steps. I do not require sleep in the way you do. But I rested sufficiently. Good to know, Mark said, taking a seat beside John. So, what's the plan now? Nissa set the cord down on the porch railing and folded her hands in front of her. I have decided. I will return to my ship and send my report. It is the only way forward. John glanced at her, his expression unreadable. And what are you going to tell them? The truth, Nissa said. I will present my observations and my conclusions regardless of the consequences. Mark whistled low. That's a gutsy move. Nissa tilted her head. It is necessary. My people must understand what I have learned here. John nodded slowly. It's the right thing to do. I hope so, she said, her voice quieter now. But it will not be easy. You faced tougher things than this, right? Mark asked. You've got the guts to come here on your own, fix your ship, deal with us. You'll manage. Nissa's lips twitched into what might have been a faint smile. I appreciate your confidence. You should, Mark said with a grin. It's not easy to earn. John stood, setting his empty mug on the railing. When do you leave? Soon, Nissa said, picking up the core. The repairs are complete. The ship is fully operational. Mark slapped John on the back. Well, I guess that's that. Guess we'll have to go back to our boring, alien-free lives. Somehow, I don't think things are going to feel boring for a while, John said. Nissa looked at him. You have been remarkably kind. More than I expected. John held her gaze. You earned it. She inclined her head. Thank you. Mark stood as well, stretching again. So, do we just wave you off or what? You need a launch countdown or something? Nissa shook her head. No countdown. My departure will be uneventful. Guess that means no fireworks either, Mark said with mock disappointment. John smirked. You just blow something up. True, Mark said, grinning. All right, Nissa. If you're ever in the neighborhood again, stop by. We've got plenty more junk you can study. Nissa actually smiled, a brief, small expression, but genuine. I will remember. The three of them made their way to the edge of the field where Nissa's sleek, silver craft was hidden among the tall grass. The ship's hull shimmered faintly in the morning light, the pulse of its engines barely audible. Nissa placed the core back inside, securing it into a slot near the cockpit. Mark gave a low whistle. Gotta admit, that's a nice ride. Sleek. I wouldn't mind taking it for a spin. You would not be able to pilot it, Nissa said. Hey, I'm a fast learner, Mark said, pretending to be offended. Nissa simply nodded. Perhaps another time. John stepped forward, his expression serious. You're sure about this? About what you're going to tell them? Yes, she said. I have made my decision. Good, John said. Then you'll be fine. Nissa looked at him, her violet eyes steady. Thank you, John. For everything. He nodded once. Take care of yourself. She inclined her head, then turned and entered the ship. The hatch closed silently behind her, and the ship's hum grew slightly louder. Mark took a step back, hands in his pockets, as the craft lifted smoothly off the ground. It hovered for a moment, then ascended rapidly, disappearing into the morning sky. The brothers watched until it was out of sight. Then Mark turned to John. So, now what? John shrugged. Back to work, I guess. Yeah, I guess so, Mark said, his grin returning. But man, what a story, huh? Who's gonna believe us? John chuckled softly. Probably no one. But that's fine by me. They walked back to the barn, ready to pick up where they'd left off, though both knew their lives would never feel quite the same. 2 months had passed since Nissa's ship vanished into the sky. Life on the farm had mostly gone back to normal, or at least as normal as it could after an experience like that. John and Mark carried on with their routines, fixing machinery, tending to the fields, and trying to push the memory of their alien visitor to the back of their minds. But some things were harder to ignore. Every now and then, John would catch himself looking up at the sky, scanning for a streak of silver or a faint, familiar hum. Mark would occasionally joke about building his own spaceship out of old tractor parts, but his laughter would always fade a little too quickly. They both felt it, a strange, empty space left behind by Nissa's departure. One evening, as the brothers were finishing up repairs on the barn's roof, a faint hum reached their ears. John froze, his hammer poised mid-swing. You hear that? Mark, balanced precariously on the edge of the roof, tilted his head. Yeah. You don't think? Before John could answer, the hum grew louder, and a familiar sleek shape emerged from the horizon, its silvery hull catching the last rays of the setting sun. Mark let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. The ship descended gracefully, landing in the same field as before. The brothers scrambled down from the roof and made their way toward it. By the time they reached the craft, the hatch was already opening. Nissa stepped out, her movements as fluid and deliberate as they remembered. Her violet eye scanned the area briefly before landing on them. You've returned, John said, his voice calm but his expression betraying his surprise. I have, Nissa replied, her tone as measured as ever. I hope my presence is not disruptive. Mark laughed. Disruptive? Lady, you're the most exciting thing that's happened around here in years. Come on in. Nissa followed them back toward the farmhouse. Once inside, they sat around the kitchen table, a pot of coffee brewing on the stove. John leaned forward, his hands clasped in front of him. Why'd you come back? Nissa hesitated. I completed my report. My people have been informed of what I observed here. Some were receptive to my conclusions. Others were not. What kind of conclusions? Mark asked, pouring himself a mug of coffee. That your species is worth knowing, Nissa said simply. That you have potential for collaboration. But not everyone agreed. John nodded. So what happens now? Nissa looked down at the table, her fingers tracing an invisible pattern on its surface. I do not know. The decision is no longer mine to make. I returned because I wanted to see this place again. To see you. Mark nearly choked on his coffee. To see us? Are you saying you missed us? Nissa's gaze met his, her expression unreadable. I found your company unexpectedly agreeable. John's eyebrows raised slightly, but he said nothing. Mark leaned back in his chair, grinning. Well, Nissa, that's just about the nicest thing anyone's ever said to me. Welcome back. They spent the evening catching up. Nissa asked about the farm, the projects they had completed, and the small challenges they had faced in her absence. Mark shared exaggerated tales of his supposed heroics, while John quietly filled in the more grounded details. Nyssa listened intently, occasionally asking questions that hinted at her ongoing curiosity about human behavior. As the night wore on, John noticed something different about Nyssa. She seemed more at ease, less guarded. There were moments when her expression softened, when her tone lost its formal edge. It wasn't quite warmth, but it was something close. Eventually, the conversation turned to her people. Mark, ever the inquisitive one, leaned forward and asked, "So, what's the deal with your people not agreeing with your report? I thought you said you were going to tell them the truth." "I did," Nyssa said. "But the truth is not always welcome. There are those who fear change, who believe that engaging with humanity could lead to conflict or chaos." "Sounds familiar," John said, his voice low. "People can be afraid of what they don't understand." Nyssa inclined her head. "Fear is a common response to the unknown, but it is not insurmountable." Mark shook his head. "That's a tough spot you're in. You stuck your neck out, and they're still fighting over it." Nyssa's expression was unreadable. "It was necessary. Whether they accept my findings or not, I have done my part." "Sounds like you're not done just yet," John said, his eyes meeting hers. Nyssa held his gaze for a moment before looking away. "Perhaps not." They sat in silence for a while, the weight of the conversation settling over them. Mark eventually stood, stretching. "Well, I'm beat. I'm gonna hit the hay." "Good to have you back, Nyssa." She nodded. "Good night, Mark." Once Mark had gone upstairs, John turned to Nyssa. "You really came back just to see us?" Nyssa hesitated, then nodded. "You represent something unexpected. Your willingness to help, your ability to adapt, your persistence. It is not what I expected from humans." John leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "We're full of surprises." Nyssa's lips quirked into the slightest smile. "Indeed you are." They sat together in the quiet kitchen, the hum of the old refrigerator the only sound. Outside, the stars shone brightly, and for the first time in a long time, the farm felt a little less ordinary.